In 1879, a young girl whose family was relocating to Bodie, California, wrote a single line in her diary before they left. She wrote, "Goodbye, God. We are going to Bodie." She was not being dramatic, she was being accurate. Bodie had 65 saloons. It had an open red light district, an opium den, and a murder rate that historians have calculated at roughly 1 killing per day. It sat at 8,375 feet above sea level, on a wind-scoured plateau in the eastern Sierra Nevada, where winters hit negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and summers baked the same ground past 100. There was no in-between, there was no mercy. And yet, 10,000 people chose to be here. Here on MAQ Ghost Town, we document the places that history built and then abandoned. Bodie is not just the most well-preserved ghost town in America, it is something stranger and something harder to explain. Because unlike most abandoned places, Bodie was not left empty, it was left intact. The boots are still under the beds, the letters are still on the desks, the sewing needle is still threaded through unfinished cloth. Nobody cleaned up, nobody packed properly. And the reason why will take the full length of this story to understand. It started with a man named William S. Bodie. In the autumn of 1859, Bodie, a prospector from Poughkeepsie, New York, made a modest gold discovery in the hills of what is now Mono County, California. The strike was not extraordinary. The California gold rush had already been burning for a decade, but the gold was real, and real gold was enough. Bodie never saw what it became. In November of that same year, caught in a blizzard on the plateau, he froze to death. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The town that eventually bore his name misspelled it. The spelling was either a printer's error or a deliberate choice by early settlers. Either way, the man became a ghost before the ghost town existed. For the next decade and a half, the settlement grew slowly. Winters drove men out. The isolation wore them down. The ore was modest. But here's the thing about gold in the earth. You never know how much is down there until the ground gives way. In 1876, a cave-in at one of the larger mine shafts accidentally exposed a new vein. Not a small one. What the miners found in that collapsed tunnel would not merely revive Bodie, it would make it one of the most dangerous places in the American West. The Standard Mining Company moved in immediately, and the world followed. Between 1877 and 1882, the Standard Mine produced an estimated $30 to $40 million in gold and silver in 19th century valuations. That is not a typo. By 1879, Bodie's population had exploded to somewhere between 8 and 10,000 people. Some estimates reach 13,000, depending on how you count the surrounding camps. It was, at its peak, the second largest city in California, and it behaved nothing like a city. 65 saloons running 24 hours, a Chinatown district, multiple newspapers, a school built to hold the children of men who killed each other in the street. Historian Roger McGrath, who wrote the definitive study of frontier California violence, calculated that Bodie's homicide rate in its peak years was approximately 100 times higher than late 20th century American cities. The violence was not incidental, it was structural. Thousands of armed, isolated men competing over gold, cards, and survival, in conditions designed to remove every social restraint. The newspapers reported killings with the same editorial detachment applied to weather and mine output. But here is what the violence obscures, if you let it. Bodie also had families, merchants, teachers, a Methodist church whose organ still sits in place today, hymn books still racked in the pews. Real life was happening here, ordinary life. And then, by the early 1880s, the richest veins began to thin. The fever was breaking, but the town was not finished. What happened next would be slower, more patient, and in some ways more devastating than anything a gun could do. Great booms do not end in an instant. They drain. Through the 1880s and into the 1890s, Bodie contracted steadily. Families left first, they always do. then the merchants who depended on families, then the skilled workers. Population in 1882 had already dropped below 4,000. By 1890, fewer than 1,500 remained. By 1900, below 500. And yet, some people stayed. The most important of them was a man named James Stewart Kane. Kane had arrived in Bodie in the 1880s as a merchant and banker. As others left, he bought their properties. Then he bought more. By the time the population had dwindled to a few dozen families in the early 20th century, Kane effectively owned most of the town. He is, in many respects, the reason Bodie still stands today. Rather than strip the abandoned buildings for lumber, the practical choice, he maintained them. He kept roofs on walls long past any economic justification. Then, in 1932, fire came, as it always did in Bodie. This time, it was catastrophic. 2/3 of the town burned in a single night. What had been a skeletal but functioning community became the ruin it mostly appears to be today. But a small population remained even after that. The last school session recorded in Bodie's schoolhouse was held in 1941. 6 children, 1 teacher. The last entry in the registers dated spring of that year. By winter, the school was empty, because something had happened that Bodie and thousands of other small American communities could not absorb. And it came not from the ground, not from fire, but from Washington, D.C., in the form of a single administrative document. On October 8, 1942, the United States War Production Board issued Limitation Order L-208. The order was sweeping. It applied to hundreds of American gold and silver mining operations. Its logic was straightforward. In a war economy, the manpower and machinery required for precious metal extraction could be redirected toward copper, steel, and coal. Gold did not build bombers. Gold did not win Pacific Islands. The order was clear. All non-essential gold and silver mines were to cease operations immediately. Bodie's remaining residents, fewer than 40 families by 1942, understood what that meant within hours of the order becoming known. There would be no wind down, no measured departure. The mine was the town's last economic justification. The order had extinguished it overnight. People left quickly, and in leaving quickly they left almost everything. Not because they were forced out at gunpoint, but because the calculation made by families in this situation is always the same. What can I carry, and what will I come back for? Most never came back. The things they intended to return for are still exactly where they left them. A half-written letter on a desk, an unsealed envelope beside it with an address written in pencil, a name we do not speak aloud, a child's crayon drawing pinned to a wall, a sewing basket with the needles still threaded through unfinished cloth, a calendar on the wall with dates crossed off through December 1941, and then nothing crossed off. The hand simply stopped. These were not ruins when the last residents walked away. These were homes. In 1962, the state of California designated Bodie a state historic park. And the decision of how to preserve it produced a philosophy that is, in the history of American heritage conservation, nearly unique. They called it arrested decay. The state does not restore Bodie. It does not rebuild. It does not replace rotting boards, repaint faded walls, or restock empty shelves. It intervenes only to prevent total structural collapse, to ensure walls do not fall catastrophically. That irreversible loss is prevented. Everything else is left exactly as it was found. The dust on the bottles in the saloon is the original dust. The cobwebs in the corners of the schoolhouse are not theatrical. The angle at which a chair leans against a wall reflects the angle at which someone left it decades ago, not the arrangement of a museum curator. Walking through Bodie is not like walking through a museum. It is like walking through a moment that refuses to end. And then there is the matter of the curse. The Bodie Curse is not the product of 19th century superstition. It is a 20th century phenomenon, and its origins lie in the park's own administrative records. In the ranger station at the entrance to Bodie, there is a large binder on a desk. That binder contains letters, hundreds of them, written by former visitors, each containing a small returned object. A rock, a nail, a fragment of glass, a sliver of wood. People who took souvenirs from Bodie began writing back to return them. Not because of legal obligation, though removing objects from a state park is technically illegal. They returned them because of what happened after they took them. The letters report, with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss, a pattern of misfortune following the removal of objects. Car accidents, job losses, illnesses, deaths in the family. One visitor returned a single small nail and described 3 years of inexplicable deterioration in every dimension of their life. Upon mailing the nail back, they reported, the deterioration stopped. The Rangers have no official position on the curse. They keep the letters. All of them. Whether you attribute the pattern to genuine supernatural agency, to confirmation bias, or simply to the weight of guilt accumulated by someone who took something that did not belong to them, the outcome is the same. People give things back. There is a particular kind of place in this world that refuses ordinary categories. Not quite ruin, not quite monument, not quite museum. Body is all three, and none of them. Every object left in that town is waiting for someone who is not coming back. The boots under the bed, the unfinished letter, the crayon drawing still pinned to the wall. The wind continues its work. Patient, indifferent, permanent. That is Bodie, and that is what we document here on MAQ Ghost Town. The places that history built, abandoned, and somehow could not bring itself to destroy.